This is American Political Thought for the week of April 5th through 9th. The material that I'm going to be discussing is Democracy in America, at least in this first module, chapters 5 and 6, and in the second module, 7, 8, and 9. These are some of the most important chapters in Democracy in America. They are key to his. You'll see that there's some very important principles of social and economic analysis that he articulates, and moreover, in these four chapters, chapters 5 and 6. Well, let me set this up this way: in 5 and 6, remember, let me back up. He's writing for a European audience who, most of whom think of democracy as an unstable form of mob rule based on the experience of the French Revolution, and therefore, remember, de Tocqueville's core purposes is to show to his generation of Europeans and subsequent generations of Europeans that that there can be such a thing as a decent democratic society, and America is that society, with exceptions, obviously. And so remember, in Volume 1, Part 1, he's introduced the reader, and let me just also say again, to go back to my first comments on the book, that this isn't just for Europeans of his or subsequent generations. This book is also addressed to future generations of democratic citizens who want to understand the highs and lows and the possibilities and limitations of the democratic society that they are inheriting and eventually leading. So these chapters are central not only to his task of making Europeans aware of the nature of American democracy, but then also in terms of making future generations of Americans aware of the tendencies of their own system of government. Now, in 5 and 6, so let me set up these two chapters. In 5, I already told you that in Volume 1, Part 1, that we already read and considered, that he's introducing the country, its geography, its social conditions, economic conditions, the rise of its political institutions, and the nature of those institutions. So in Volume 1, Part 2, he's actually turning to how democratic society and government really actually works. And just to remind you, we've already done chapters 1 through 4. Chapter 1, which I talked quite a bit about, that very short paragraph-like chapter. The premise of that chapter and of this whole part of the book is that America is really a democracy. The majority really rule. And what that means is, again, you have to understand what he means in chapter 1 of part 2 of volume 1, that in America, once a persistent enough and long-lasting enough majority forms, that it becomes irresistible in politics and society. That's what he means by majority rule and democratic government. So in the next three chapters, chapters 2, 3, and 4, parties, press, and associations, these are the primary mechanisms by which the majority becomes aware of itself, primarily through the free play of opinions in the free press, how it begins to organize itself through free associations. And note that these three things, parties, associations, and the press, in this part of the book, he discusses them as ways that the majority becomes aware of itself, forms, and asserts itself politically. Parties. So that's what press, associations, and parties have. They are the mechanisms of the majority becoming aware of itself, forming, and acting politically. In volume 2, part 2, he's actually going to come back to these and discuss them as means for the minority in a democracy to defend themselves against the majority. So with that in mind, in chapters 5 and 6, 5 is then he steps back and says, okay, so how does it work? So let's look at the claims that for and against democracy, primarily for democracy, and how does it really work? How does the system of democratic government really operate? And he picks several critical ways of measuring it. We're going to see like the quality of people elected, not good, as you're going to see. He debunks that myth that democratic free elections mean the election, as Jefferson, who was the greatest apologist of the notion that elections are forms of elevating the best people to rule. Tocqueville says, not true, and we'll see why. And then he also discusses legislative instability because the majority is always changing and new people are getting elected, and therefore there's a certain instability in American laws. That's you can look at that; it's an interesting thing. Also, administrative instability because people were voted in and out of office and they run things differently. Just look at the difference between the Trump administrations and the Biden administrations. Regardless of where you stand on which one is good and which one isn't, or which one is loathsome and which one isn't, nevertheless, you can see how constant overturning in the administrative part of government, the executive part of government, would lead to a certain administrative instability. And you can pick any number of public policies to see that. What I want to concentrate on is, and that's what makes this chapter, chapter 5, in part 2 of volume 1, so important, is he lays out a framework of economic class analysis to identify the middle class in America. Who is the middle class? What are their instincts? What do they bring to society and government? And we'll concentrate on that. This is one of the most important parts of the entire book. And then in chapter 6, after having seen how democracy operates, chapter 6 is entitled The Advantages of Government by Democracy in America. And as you're going to see, what he's really doing is, since chapter 6 harkens back to the beginning of the book, the author's introduction, and since Tocqueville believes that the moment that we're in, starting with the late 1700s and even going through our time today, that this is the core turning point in world history. This is the point in which almost the default setting for political rule in humanity was royal and aristocratic rule. This is the period when it's switching over in the coming centuries to democratic rule. Now, as I've already suggested from the author's introduction and also from Volume 1, Part 1, Chapter 4, that short chapter on the sovereignty of the people, de Tocqueville probably really does think that the coming of democratic social and political conditions is unavoidable, and primarily because, as I suggested from my interpretation of Chapter 4 in Part 1, it's because he really thinks that the doctrine of the sovereignty of the people is true, that human beings are genuinely really equal as Democrats conceive that, which means in some ways that even though he was born into an aristocratic class, and even though in chapter 6 he's kind of what he's trying to do in chapter 6, as you'll see, he's trying to bring you up to the top of the mountain and look back to the centuries, really from all of human history, and forward to the aristocratic past, and forward to the democratic future. And this is the great comparison, this chapter, chapter 6. What he's really doing is saying, okay, given this great shift in politics and society, this shift towards democracy, and bear in mind that when he says democracy, he means not only the American regime and the regimes of Western Europe, which we would call liberal democratic, or at the end of Volume 1, at the conclusion, when he sees the world divided by Russia and America, it's not so much the Russian part, but he sees the coming world divided by two kinds of democracy, radical and liberal, or decent, moderated versus radical, egalitarian, and totalitarian. That's why he conceived of the world at the end of Volume 1 as being split by the Russians. The fact that today it looks like it's going to be the Americans and the Chinese in this century rather than the Russians, although who knows, that's relatively secondary to the fact that he thought that the coming centuries would be a division between two kinds of democracy. And that's what Russia, eventually the Soviet Union, which you could say prophesied, but the People's Republic. You have to remember that by democratic government, Tocqueville would include not only the Nazi regime, which was democratic. After all, the Nazi party means Nationalsozialisten Demokratische Arbeiterpartei, the National Socialistic Democratic Workers' Party. So it was a socialist party. And that socialism, the Soviet Socialist Republics, the People's Republic of China, that all of these things that we call tyranny or authoritarianism, totalitarianism, He also considered to be species of democracy. So the question, remember, is not whether the coming ages of humanity will be democratic, but what kind of democracy will they be, and whether that will be good or bad for humanity. That's the question he gets to in chapter 6, as you'll see. So let's walk through these two chapters 5 and 6, and then we'll do 7 and 8. And then, by the way, after establishing the nature of democratic rule in America, and then the advantages versus democracy in part 6, then de Tocqueville turns in chapter 7 and 8 to the most important subject of the book, and that is the nature of democratic tyranny, which is tyranny of the majority. The two great documents in the modern world about the nature of democratic majoritarian tyranny are Federalist 10 by Madison and these two chapters, 7 and 8, in Volume 1, Part 2 of Democracy in America. This is where de Tocqueville rises to the summit, so to speak, of political theory and political analysis, based not only on his reading of the philosophical classes, but his actual observance of the way democratic society works. And bearing in mind, like I told you that at the beginning, that de Tocqueville's political science is sort of like a combination of Aristotle and Montesquieu, sort of an ancient and modern. The Aristotelian part of de Tocqueville's political science is that all regimes, even democratic regimes, can have a dark side, have a tyrannical side. So the question is not whether democracy can produce a tyrannical state of affairs. The question is what leads to that, how does that work, and as you're going to see in chapter 8, what can temper that. So it turns out even democracy can be tyrannical, and there are many interesting things going on in our political system today. De Tocqueville, I think, accurately predicted in terms of the tyrannical tendencies of democracy. In fact, I'm going to lay out a sub-thesis that what we're calling white supremacy or something like that, or systemic racism, actually is what de Tocqueville calls majority tyranny. Now, the reason I think people don't want to call it that is because people can't think that people don't think it's possible for democracy to be bad. So what I want you to take away from this class is not so much um, is not whether or not there's something called white supremacy, but I'm trying to enlarge your framework and suggest that the real problem is not something called white supremacy or systemic racism. It's because America is a democracy, and even democracies can be tyrannical. If you can walk away from this class with that point, you will have learned something. All right. So let's plow through chapter 5 and chapter 6 and see what he's trying to teach us here. So really, right from the beginning on pages 197 and 198 and 199, debunking a core myth, as I already said, that free elections elevate the best, the natural aristocracy. Um, uh, so, um, um, so not so. In fact, free elections have a tendency to uh, elevate mediocrities and exploiters, politicians, as we might call them today. Why? First of all, the suggestion that universal suffrage, letting everyone vote and having free elections, um, um, as the paraphrase gloss, if you're looking on page 197. In the United States, the most outstanding men are seldom called on to direct public affairs. Now, he does make an exception. The founding generation um, was a generation of remarkable individuals, and that the nation benefited from that. But then after the party system kind of got going, and remember, he's writing in the 1830s when the spoil system and the two parties pretty much was on its way to having, as we saw in Volume 1, Part 2, Chapter 2 on political parties, what he calls small parties, even though American parties encompass the majority of the individuals in America. The differences between them, he says, tend to be small, hence the political parties are small parties. But there can be times when you have great parties, parties of great difference in principle. We may be approaching something like that now, given the level of partisanship in our political system. But anyway, so let's just see on page 187. He sets up the question and then he addresses it. In Europe, many people either believe without saying or saying without believing that one of the great advantages of universal suffrage is to summon men worthy of public confidence to the direction of affairs. The people, men say, do not know themselves how to rule, but always sincerely desire the good of the state, and their instinct unfailingly tells them who are filled with the same desire and most capable of wielding power. Um, for my part, I am bound to say that what I saw in America gives me no cause to think that that is so. Why? When I arrived in what did he see? When I arrived in the United States, I discovered with astonishment that good qualities were common among the governed, but rare among the rulers. In our day, it is a constant fact. The most outstanding Americans are seldom summoned to public office. And it must be recognized that this tendency has increased as democracy has gone beyond its previous limits. It is clear that during the last 50 years, the race of American statesmen has strangely shrunk. One can point to several reasons for this phenomenon. And my guess is um, most of the people in this class would probably agree that our political class is not exactly uh, um, what you would call the yellow crayons in the drawer. To use an expression that students once used to describing themselves, that I'm not the yellow crayon in the drawer. Well, it turns out, or the yellow crayon in the box. So why? Well, first of all, there's an inherent limit. I like to use as an example for the limits of political life the concept of the asymptote. Asymptote, asymptote. It's actually a mathematical term. It refers to the limit of a hyperbolic curve. An asymptote is a limit. If you remember from high school algebra, a hyperbola is a curve that approaches a limit but never maxes. Like for instance, if if you had a curve described by cutting um, x into two subsets, then you would have an infinite progression of halved sections that would approximate but never touch the curve. So uh, he's about to point out in this middle paragraph on page 197 a fundamental asymptote of democratic life. Whatever one does, it is impossible to raise the standard of enlightenment in a nation above a certain level. Whatever facilities are made available for acquiring information and whatever improvements in teaching technique make knowledge available cheaply, men will never educate and develop their intelligence without devoting time to the matter. There you have a fundamental limit on the elevatability of democratic society. Whatever else you want to say about aristocrats who don't have to work for a living and grow up in a privileged environment and are educated, they get a profound and deep education. Americans just don't care about that stuff, as we're going to see when we come back to the mental habits of Americans in Volume 2, Part 1, in which he points out that we're practical, superficial. We like spark notes or cliff notes rather than reading the original thing. And we want it straight and simple and useful. And beyond that, we don't pay much attention. There are people who can become nuclear physicists in America, but that's not what everybody rushes to major in at American colleges and universities. So he points out in a democracy, especially as we're going to see when we get to the middle of this chapter and we analyze the social and economic instincts of the middle class, the comfortable poor, as you'll see. These are people who are constantly struggling to get ahead because they're afraid of slipping into poverty and they want more comfort. That's how the American middle class. And therefore, these are not people that will give extensive parts of their lives to educating themselves deeply about the nature of reality. So as a result, there's a limit to what democratic peoples, no matter what the media, and I think, by the way, I would say that, remember, this was written in 1831, but in the 20th and 21st century, with radio and television and movies and the internet, I think, and near universal education, that when you look at our political advertising, for instance, and this will confirm what he says later, that democratic elections are essentially undignified processes. And if you've ever run for office, whether it's a student office or something, there is an undignified aspect of running for office, and he points that out. So there you have it. Therefore, you can only ask even educated democratic peoples who have access to information. They're only going to inform themselves to a certain amount of extent on these things. And in this time of like media polarization and superficiality, I have to say this is even true. Take for an example the Georgia election bill that's gotten so much press. I actually read all 95 pages of the bill. And I have to tell you, the way that this is being discussed has very little to do with the actual text of the bill. I don't care what your position on this is. All I'm saying is the the level of public commentary that's dominated our public life is so superficial and unconnected to the reality of the bill, but that's not exceptional. That's generally the case. And to think that democracy is going to be any different from that is illusory. So much for Star Trek and the infinite perfectibility of the human mind. Baloney. America means mediocrity. Democracy means mediocrity on the whole. Now, there are exceptions to that mediocrity, which even de Tocqueville was pessimistic about. And so, as we'll see, there may be more possibility for profundity and achievement in democracy. But generally speaking, remember, democracy means the rule of the majority. The majority means the most means the middle, and the middle means mediocre. So that's true of elections. And by the way, he had one other interesting thing on page 199. On the bottom 198, 199. In the United States, the people have no hatred towards the higher classes in society, but they have little goodwill towards them and are careful to keep them from power. They are not afraid of great talents, but have little taste for them. In general, one notices that anyone who has risen without the people's support has difficulty in winning their favor. And then here's the psychological underpinning of what he just said on the bottom of this page and the top of 199. While the natural instincts of democracy lead the people to keep men of distinction from power, an equally strong instinct diverts the latter from a political career, in which it would be difficult to remain completely themselves or to make any progress without cheapening themselves. Chancellor Kent gives very ingenious expression to this feeling. For this famous author, after singing the praise of the part of the Constitution which gives the executive the right to appoint judges, says, the fittest men would probably have too much reservedness of manners and severity of morals to secure an election resting on universal suffrage. So not only do the people, even though they claim to want excellence in office, they actually envy it and don't trust excellence. And the most excellent people in America don't run for office because it's so degrading. States have experimented with, for instance, electing judges rather than appointing them. It's not pretty. Anyway, so much for that. And I've already mentioned he talks about legislative mutability and administrative instability, very interesting things. But now I want to go to the heart of this chapter, which is, it's interesting. It starts on page 208 in the following pages, and it's under the rubric of public expenses under the rule of democracy. And so the question he's technically articulating here is will democratic governments spend more than aristocratic governments? And of course, in terms, it says yes and no. I mean, aristocratic governments love conquest and foreign wars and imperialism. And so that's, plus they love spending on their own particular class. Democratic governments are more modest in some ways. But again, especially once the welfare bug gets into the populace, then his suggestion is that public expenses will rise because the middle classes will especially look to the state to provide them the benefits of material life rather than them securing for themselves through the free market. But more about that. But why is this section so important? Beginning on 209, you can tell when an author is articulating a fundamental framework, and here he is articulating a fundamental framework. Societies, this is the middle of 209. And again, de Tocqueville's telling you that he's articulating not just a set of interesting observations, but he means what he's laying out here is pretty much a universal rule of human life. So let's look at his framework of analysis and what he does with it. Societies, like other organized bodies, are shaped according to certain fixed rules from which they cannot escape. They are made up of certain elements which are found at all times and in all places. And again, if an author uses language like this, you've gotten to the fundamental dimensions of his political science. This is human nature and human society at work, according to de Tocqueville. Now, you could be wrong about this, but at least you have to see that here you've reached a fundamental limit of his thought, layer of his thought. It will always be easy, theoretically, to divide each people up into three classes. The first class is composed of the rich. By the way, what defines the rich is they don't have to work. They are independently wealthy, so therefore they don't have to work to stay alive. The second of those who, without being rich, are in all respects comfortably off. That's the middle class. The third class include those with little or no property, who live primarily from the work which the other two classes provide for them. The poor. And the definition of poor is people that have to work for a living. Um, uh, the individuals in these various categories may be more or less numerous according to the state of society, but no contrivance will prevent these classes from existing. Even the most advanced welfare state or the most advanced socialist or communist state won't eliminate these classes, as, by the way, the Soviet Union showed. Um, um, so it is clear um, that, so he's about to explain why he's raising the question of these three fundamental classes in society: the rich, the middle class, and the poor, and what's unique about America. Um, it is clear that each of these classes will introduce certain instincts peculiar to itself into the management of state finances. Suppose that the first class alone makes the laws. It probably will not take much trouble to economize public money, for a tax on a substantial fortune takes away only some of what is superfluous, with barely perceptible effect. But suppose it is the middle classes who make the laws. And by the way, that's ultimately why Tocqueville is going on and on about these three classes of society. Let me just kind of bring it out into the open. Um, the poor are always the majority of society. But America has created, in some ways, a new kind of unprecedented situation. The middle class, the comfortable poor. Um, most Americans still have to work for a living, but unlike the poor in other countries, and believe me, I've been in Egypt and I've been in India and South Carolina, three third world nations, and there you have to say that's where you really see what poverty means. The vast majority of human beings were impoverished, pious peasants throughout most of human history. And that meant that they didn't have much. Well, they didn't have the experience of comfort or the ability to change their situation in life. So, in some ways, the majority of people, even in America, are still poor. But the reason they're not, it's like the difference that economists make between relative and absolute poverty. Um, 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 a majority of Americans are poor in the sense that they have to work for a living, but they've acquired enough property to feel the comforts of the middle class. And they are the majority, and that's why de Tocqueville is discussing them. Because remember, in a democracy, the majority sets the tone of society, whether it's economically, culturally, religiously, or racially or ethnically. The majority sets the tone. Um, and um, and so, what does it mean then for state expenses, for public expenses, that the people that the majority in America are these comfortable poor? And by the way, this will point backwards to this important chapter that we saw in Volume 1, Part 1, Chapter 3, when he talks about the abolition of primogeniture and the fluidity of property. That's what led to this unprecedented situation. And by the way, that's why, as he points out, and as Marxists have lamented for a century and a half, why socialism, up till now anyway, and we'll see that de Tocqueville predicted that socialism would eventually come to dominate the American political order. In fact, all modern democracies. But at least you could say the reason that socialism never got a foothold is because all Americans had some taste of private property. And remember, since it was fluid, and that especially determines the majority of these middle class poor people, the comfortable poor, as that's the term I coined to describe what Tocqueville means here. In other words, the vast majority of Americans have some property. In other words, they don't hate property like the working poor in other nations hated the aristocratic classes, because to be aristocratic meant to have wealth, and to not to be aristocratic meant you were poor. And so, but that's not true in America. Everyone has some property, and it's fluid, which means that you can change your position. You can get more property, or you can lose what you have. And as you're going to see, why is this so important in terms of analyzing the character of the American people and predicting our future? It's because once you get a little taste of comfort in life, you like it and you don't want to lose it. So, uh, what America has created is a majority of people who are poor enough to have to work, but yet comfortable enough to experience some of the goodness of life. And by the way, don't forget, when we conclude with the book and see where we're going as a society in the future of the human race, another aspect of de Tocqueville's analysis, which is not so prominent but it's still there, is the unfolding of the modern scientific revolution. Because obviously, modern science is creating a situation where there really is, as Marx predicted and other scientists like Descartes predicted, is science itself would eventually revolutionize the very economic conditions of life on Earth. And therefore, as science proceeds, more and more of the human race will experience more and more of those creature comforts that determine the middle class. And so, as you're going to see, let me plug this into where this is going in terms of the whole book. As long as the middle class is attached to the fluidity of property, which we could call the free market or capitalism, and therefore accept a certain amount of inequality and uncertainty in the enjoyment of the material conditions of life, then you'll have a modern democracy. The moment that the middle class becomes so fearful of losing its taste of comfort and freedom and becomes envious of inequalities of wealth, it will eventually attach itself to socialism and turn to the centralized welfare administrative state to do what the free market used to do, unreliably, unequally, and that's why ultimately the Tocqueville predicts that most modern democracy will eventually collapse into centralized socialism. That's the plot of the book that we'll see. But anyway, um, so um, uh, so you see at the bottom of 209, as most of the voters then have no taxable property. This is when people are really poor. Um, well, here, let's back up one paragraph. Um, Finally, supposing that the last class has exclusive control of lawmaking, then I see every chance of public expenditure growing rather than decreasing, and that for two reasons. As most of the voters have no taxable property, apparently all money spent in the interest of society can only profit and never harm them. And those who do have a little property easily find ways of imposing a tax so that it will weigh only on the rich and bring nothing but profit to the poor. And that is something like the like of which the rich cannot do when they are masters of the government. That is to say, as the taste for material comfort and security increases among the comfortable poor, they will turn to the government to make sure that they are comfortable and secure, which means where does the money for that come from? From the rich. Countries, therefore, when lawmaking falls exclusively, this is on top of page 210, um, the poor cannot help for much economy and public expenditures. Expenditures will always be considerable either because taxes cannot touch those who vote for them or because they are assured in a way to prevent that. In other words, a democratic government is the only one in which those who vote for a tax can escape the obligation to pay it. Or, in the words of President Biden, if you make less than $400,000, you won't see a tax increase. Now, whether or not that's true or not, you can investigate that claim, but you understand the nature of the claim that he's making, that the vast majority of Americans will pay no extra tax. Who will pay the tax to support all the aspects of the welfare state? The rich will. And that's essentially what de Tocqueville predicted. On the top of 211, there will, however, be less danger of extravagance in an increasingly property-owned democracy, partially because the people will less need the wealthy's money, and because it will become ever more difficult to contrive a tax which will not touch the people themselves. So, again, what the Tocqueville's talking about is everything's in transition. And in all likelihood, the economic fluidity which generated the majority of middle class, the wealthy, the comfortable poor in America, those conditions will not survive forever and ultimately will give rise to greater taxation, greater redistribution, and etc., as we'll see as the book unfolds. Um, and by the way, to tie in this growing taste for material comfort and security, he points to that on a little bit further on 211. The thirst for improvement then is concerned with thousands of different matters. It goes into infinite detail and is especially bent on those types of improvement that require expenditure, for it is a question of bettering the lot of the poor who cannot help themselves. So that's why people will increasingly turn to the government to spend things to help them get the things they want that the middle class economy couldn't otherwise have provided. So that's the key to um, the future of the American middle class. And by the way, in chapter 10, I postponed chapter 10 because it talks about the three races. We're going to come back to this. But the spirits of this middle class majority, he has a nice description of this on page 404 in chapter 10 of volume 1, part 2. The universal movement prevailing in the United States, the frequent reversals of fortune, the unexpected shifts in public and private wealth, all unite to keep the mind in a sort of feverish agitation, partially fed by commercials and advertisements. Spend, 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 buy, buy, buy. um, um, to keep the mind in a sort of feverish agitation which wonderfully disposes it towards every type of exertion and keeps it, so to say, above the common level of humanity. Europeans for 200 years have said all Americans care about is money. They care about buying and getting more money and spending things. Well, there's some truth to that. And Tocqueville's just explained to you why that is. If you are born as a peasant in permanent classes and therefore have no hope of changing your material or social or political condition, then you will die what you are born is. But if you are born in a fluid middle class society, for reasons that we've already seen since the beginning of the book, then you have a kind of ability to change your life and therefore look forward to bettering your life. And as de Tocqueville predicts, eventually, as democratic society matures, the majority will look to the government to redistribute the wealth of society so as to improve their lot. For an American, the whole of life is treated like a game of chance, a time of revolutions, or the day of battle. These same causes, this is on page 404, working simultaneously on every individual, finally give an irresistible impulse to the national character. Choose any American at random, and he should be a man of burning desires, enterprising, adventurous, and above all, an innovator. The same bent affects all he does. It plays a part in politics, his religious doctrines, his theories of social economy, and his domestic occupation. He carries it with him into the depths of the backwoods as well as the city's business. The same spirit. So, by the way, as long as Americans see themselves as capable of getting a little more property and or losing their property, that describes the American spirit. And I think that's pretty accurate, by the way. Now, again, whether that will be replaced with another dimension, we'll see as the book unfolds. So let's come then to so this is how democracy really works in chapter 5. As already suggested in chapter 6, de Tocqueville is now walking up to the summit of historical perspective and asking you to look backwards to the aristocratic ages and forward to the coming democratic ages. And so, as you're going to see, what he's doing in this chapter is he's asking you, well, what do you think? Will humanity be better off in the aristocratic past or in the democratic future? And as you're going to see, it depends on what you expect from human life. And to go back to the beginnings of the book, this is one of the major sets of passages in this entire massive volume where he turns to the reader and addresses the reader as you. So it's as if he's underlining the uh, um, the whole question. So just a couple of issues in this chapter to walk through. He talks about the kinds of patriotism, emotional and rational, versus, and he says in America, Americans love their country, but it's not like the old love of motherland like European countries did, like when the Tsar had to rally the Russian peasants to fight Napoleon, or Stalin had to rally the Russian workers to fight the Nazis by appealing to the motherland rather than the socialist international. And so, in some ways, the Tocqueville says, well, Americans so identify their personal situation with their country that their patriotism is a kind of a rational self-interest. I've got it good, therefore I love my country. That's kind of what he suggests. And partially, and he's got us right. Remember, de Tocqueville is the great, not only theorist of democratic ideas, but the great psychologist of democratic ideas. And on page 237, um, uh, he locates this embrace of, of healthy self-interest in the idea of rights. And as we've seen from our examination of the Declaration of Independence, um, uh, uh, that's he doesn't discuss the document of the Declaration, but it's clear that the notion of human rights is this kind of rational self-interest. And by the way, in these passages on 237 to 239, um, uh, he's suggesting that how does rights work as both a principle of personal identity and a morality? First of all, remember, as we saw from our discussion of the Declaration, the idea of natural rights means that you are born with certain natural needs, and because you're born with them, they're good. They're good by nature. Hence, it's good that nature makes you need and want things and gives you the freedom to get the things you want. That's a kind of principle of rational self-interest, rational egoism. But then here's the other thing. Once you admit that it's a right within you, what makes it a right within you also makes it a right within other human beings. So if you recognize your own right to these things, by definition, de Tocqueville points out in these passages, is why he thinks the idea of rights is almost as beautiful as the idea of virtue, then you have to recognize that other people have and want the same needs and wants. So there is a kind of a moral dimension. That not that you're obligated to satisfy other people's needs, but you're at least obligated to recognize that they have as legitimate a claim to the things they need and want that you do to yours. And that tension between self-interest and regarding others or seeing the same basis of self-interest in other people is in fact the core moral dimension of the notion of rights, as we're going to see as he will analyze this more. And the point he does point out, by the way, that whereas the vast majority of human beings, this is on page 239, and this is a very sobering passage, and this is where he also turns to the reader as you. Not only was the old humanity aristocratic and royal, you might say, but it was also religious. And he's quite aware of the fact that the modern world is not just democratic, but it's also secular, and that religions are fading, and that seems to be ripped out of our headlines today, by the way. For the first time, fewer American, they did some survey just last week, it being April 5th to 9th of this week, that showed that for the first time, the number of Americans who associate with an organized religion has sunk beneath the majority, about 47%. America was, up until recently, the last couple of years, the most religious, middle-class, modern industrial economy, society. So, and then page 239. Do you not see that religions are growing weak and that the conception of the sanctity of rights is vanishing? Do you not see that mores are changing and that the moral conception of rights is being obliterated with them? Do you not notice how on all sides beliefs are giving ways to arguments and feelings to calculations? If among this universal collapse you do not succeed in linking the idea of rights to personal interest, which provides the only stable point in the human heart, what other means will be left to you to govern the world, if not fear? It's a pretty sobering thing. What that means is the only concept that's going to have any play in the future among the masses of humanity is the concept of rights. And therefore, if you're going to try to have people have some kind of moral sense, since religion is fading, then you better connect it with the natural basis of self-interest, which is rights. And you're going to see, insofar as modern democracy can be saved from mediocrity and tyranny, it will depend upon the ability of democratic statesmen in the future to elevate the concept of self-interest and to combine it with liberty and law. That's de Tocqueville in one sentence. So let's come to the big comparison then. So which is it better? Is look on page 245. So this is where he brings us to this great perspective. What's better? Which is better for humanity, the aristocratic past or the democratic future? And remember it, as we saw when I was talking about the author's introduction of Volume 1, Part 1, the author's introduction, but also in terms of Chapter 4 of Part 1, Volume 1, the sovereignty of the people. Remember, he thinks that the notion of human equality is truer than inequality. But that doesn't mean that if the democratic future of humanity is truer, it doesn't mean it's going to be more beautiful or even better. Could it be that the democratic future of humanity will make things worse for humanity? It is possible, as you'll see. So, which is better, aristocracy or democracy? And you'll see my cute way of putting this in a minute. But he brings this question to its peak on page 245. What do you expect from you? Remember, he's talking now to you, the reader. What do you expect from society and its government? We must be clear about that. Do you wish to raise mankind to an elevated and generous view of things of this world? Do you want to inspire men with a certain scorn of material goods? Do you hope to engender deep convictions and prepare the way for acts of profound devotion? Are you concerned with refining mores, elevating manners, and causing the arts to blossom? Do you desire poetry, renown, and glory? Do you set out to organize a nation so that it will have a powerful influence over all others? Do you expect it to attempt great enterprises and whatever the results of the efforts to leave a great mark? If in your view that should be the main object of men in society, do not support democratic government. It will surely not lead you. But if you think it profitable to turn man's intellectual and moral activity to the necessities of physical life and use them to produce well-being, if you think that reason is more use to men than genius. And if your object is not to create heroic virtues, but rather tranquil habits, if you would rather contemplate vices than crimes, and prefer fewer transgressions at the cost of fewer splendid deeds, if in the place of a brilliant society you're content to live in one that watches the Beverly Hillbillies or whatever, or the Big Bang Theory, whatever the current mediocre soap opera is that constitutes American entertainment. If in the place of brilliant you're content to live in one that is prosperous, and finally, if in your view the main object of government is not to achieve the greatest strength of glory for the nation as a whole, but to provide for every individual therein the utmost well-being, protecting him as far as possible from all afflictions, then it is good to make conditions equal and to establish a democratic government. But there is no time left to make a choice, and if a force beyond human control is already carrying you, this little recapitulation of the author's introduction, the inevitability of democracy, is already carrying you along regardless of your desires towards one of these types of governments, then at least seek to derive from it all the good it can do. And understanding its good and instincts as well as its inclinations, try to restrain the latter and promote the former. So, what's the great choice for humanity? As I like to put in the middle of the notes, Versailles versus Walmart. Um, so, what's better? If you've been to Versailles, you understand this concentration of resources in this upper 1% of society. Beautiful, remarkable. You go to Walmart and you buy your little plastic deck chairs, which, of course, I have little plastic deck chairs on my backyard, my back deck. So, so what do you want? A world of prosperous and comfortable mediocrity, or a world of remarkable genius and concentration of forces in the tiny minority of society? It's either Versailles or Walmart, and and I think it would be fair to say America and humanity has chosen Walmart, which is why they're all coming to America and not to France.